By the fire's glow, the truth is always revealed. Welcome to the Fireside Casebook.
Chapter 1, The Prophet of Doom and a Poached Fish the Rain in Lochdubh, did not fall so much as it hovered, a fine, pervasive mist that the locals called soft weather, but which anyone else would have called a nuisance. It clung to the heather, turned the peat into a treacherous sponge, and settled into the wool of PC Hamish Macbeth's jumper, until he smelled faintly of damp sheep. Hamish did not mind. He was currently crouched by the banks of the Andan, his long, lanky frame hidden behind a cluster of gorse. His shock of ginger hair was tucked under a shapeless tweed cap, and his hazel eyes were fixed with predatory intensity on a silver ripple in the dark water. In his hand was a telescopic rod, an implement that was strictly illegal for use in this particular stretch of water, which belonged to the estate of Colonel Halberton Smythe. Beside him, Lugs, a dog of such indeterminate breed that he looked like a rug that had sprouted ears and a tail, sat perfectly still. Lugs knew the rules of poaching as well as his master. Keep quiet, keep low, and for heaven's sake, don't bark if you see the water bailiff. With a flick of his wrist that was as graceful as a fly fisherman's dream, Hamish cast. The hook bit. A moment of frantic, splashing struggle ensued, a silver flash against the peat-brown deep sand, then a fine Atlantic salmon lay gasping on the grass. "That'll do for the pot, Lugs," Hamish murmured, his voice a low Highland drawl. "A bit of butter, some wild garlic. We'll eat like kings while the rest of the world worries about the price of beef." His contentment was short-lived. The silence of the glen was shattered by the aggressive, high-pitched whine of a high-performance engine. Hamish winced. Such a sound did not belong in the Highlands. It was the sound of money, impatience, and the South. He quickly stowed the salmon in a burlap sack, collapsed his rod, and retreated toward the road, looking for all the world like a simple copper out for a casual stroll. By the time a gleaming, oversized Land Rover defendeth kind that had never seen a speck of actual mudroad around the bend, Hamish was leaning nonchalantly against a fence post, picking his teeth with a bit of dry grass. The vehicle screeched to a halt, kicking up gravel. The driver's side window rolled down with a smooth electric hum. The man inside was an assault on the Highland aesthetic. He wore a crisp, white linen shirt despite the damp, a pair of designer sunglasses pushed up into a mane of perfectly highlighted hair, and an expression of profound irritation. He looked like he had been airlifted directly from a trendy gallery in Chelsea and dropped into the middle of a bog. "You there, Constable!" the man shouted. Hamish blinked slowly, adopting his most vacant, rustic expression. "Good morning to you, sir. Or afternoon, nearly. It's a fine, soft day." "It's bloody miserable," the man snapped. "I'm looking for the sanctuary. It's a cottage somewhere near the loch. I've bought it, but the directions provided by that useless estate agent are gibberish." Hamish knew the sanctuary. It was a lonely, draughty croft house on the far side of the loch, recently renovated with far too much glass and chrome. "Ah, y'all be Mr. Julian Vane, then. The one from the television?" The man straightened his shoulders, his irritation momentarily eclipsed by vanity. "I am. I'm here for a period of spiritual realignment and to finish my new book, The Purity of Silence. I expect total peace, Constable. I hope the locals aren't the rowdy sort." Hamish suppressed a grin. The thought of the elderly residents of Lochdubh being rowdy was laughable, unless one counted the time Mrs. Emma Garrow had hit the postman with her handbag. "Oh, it's very quiet, Mr. Vane, except for the wind, and the sheep, and the occasional stramash at the pub, but a man of your piety will surely find the solitude he seeks." Vane looked Hamish up and down, noting the frayed cuffs of his uniform and the mud on his boots. "Try to keep the stramashes to a minimum. I pay a great deal in taxes to ensure I am not disturbed by the peasantry." Without waiting for a reply, Vane surged forward, the Land Rover's engine roaring as he sped toward the loch, nearly splashing Lugs with a puddle. Hamish watched the red taillights vanish. A Sassenach prophet of purity, he sighed to Lugs. He won't last a month before the midges eat him alive. He turned to head back to the police station, his mind on the poached salmon in his bag. But his heart sank as he saw the light flashing on the external wall of the station. It was the signal that a call was diverted from headquarters in Strathbane. That meant DCI Blair was likely on the warpath, or worse, there was actual work to be done. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish sighed. "The piece is over. I can feel it in my bones." Chapter 2. The purification of Julian Vane. The smell of poaching salmon is a delicate thing. A mix of river water, salt, and the illicit thrill of a successful crime. Back at the police station, a small, whitewashed building that served as both Hamish's office and his hum with fish was simmering gently on the heavy iron stove. Hamish sat in his worn armchair, a cracked mug of industrial-strength coffee in his hand, watching the steam rise. He was just reaching for a hunk of crusty bread when the telephone on his desk gave a shrill, demanding ring. Hamish stared at it with profound loathing. "Ignore it, Lugs," he whispered. "It'll just be Mrs. Gillespie complaining that the neighbour's cat looked at her cross-eyed again." The phone rang 10 times. Silence followed. Hamish sighed with relief and reached for the salmon. The phone rang again. This time it didn't stop. With a groan that suggested he was being asked to climb Ben Nevis in his slippers, Hamish stood up and snatched the receiver. Lochdubh Police, PC Macbeth speaking. This had better be a matter of life and death, or at least a very large fire. "Hamish!" Oh, thank goodness. It was the voice of Mrs. Kennedy from the post office, and she sounded more breathless than usual. "You must come down to the village square immediately. It's that new man, the one with the fancy car and the shiny hair." "Mr. Warne?" Hamish asked, his heart sinking. "Has he crashed his Land Rover into the loch?" No. He's in the fountain, Hamish. And he's not moving. And he's wearing, but it's certainly not decent for a Tuesday morning." Hamish hung up, looked regretfully at his half-cooked salmon, and turned off the stove. Duty calls Lugs, and it's a duty that sounds suspiciously like a headache. The village square of Lochdubh was a modest affair, centred around a Victorian drinking fountain that had been gifted to the village by a guilt-ridden distillery owner in 1892. It hadn't flowed with water in 30 years, serving instead as a convenient perch for seagulls and a repository for empty crisp packets. A small crowd had already gathered, standing at a respectful, yet intensely curious, distance. As Hamish approached, his lanky frame casting a long shadow in the misty light, the villagers parted. "Morning, Hamish," muttered Archie McLean, the local fisherman. "I think the Sassenach's broken your fountain." Hamish stepped forward and stopped dead. Julian Vane, the prophet of purity, was indeed in the fountain. He was draped over the granite basin in a pose that suggested a very dramatic, very failed attempt at a backbend. He was dressed in a skin-tight, head-to-toe white spandex yoga suit that left absolutely nothing to the imagination. His expensive highlights were matted with bird droppings, and his face, usually a mask of pampered arrogance, was a startling shade of eggplant purple. His tongue was protruding slightly, and his eyes were wide, staring at the grey Highland sky with an expression of eternal outrage. "Is he doing the mindfulness?" asked Mrs. Garrow, peering over Hamish's shoulder. "He told me yesterday that he intended to become one with the elements." "Well," Hamish said softly, his hazel eyes narrowing as he took in the scene, "he's certainly managed that. He's as cold as the stone he's sitting on." Hamish didn't touch the body. He didn't need to. He could see the faint white froth at the corners of Vane's mouth, and the way his fingers were cramped into rigid claws. There was a small green glass bottle lying in the dust at the base of the fountain, its cork missing. Hamish leaned down, sniffing the air. Beneath the scent of damp wool and salt air, there was something else, a bitter, almond-like tang that didn't belong in a Scottish village. Right then, Hamish sighed, standing up and dusting off his knees. Nobody touch anything, especially not that bottle. "Archie, go and call the doctor. Not that it'll do, mister. Vane much good, but we need the official word." "Is it a heart attack, Hamish?" someone called out. "Too much kale, I expect. It's not natural for a man to eat that much green." "I don't think it was the kale," Hamish murmured to Lugs, who was sniffing suspiciously at the base of the fountain. Hamish looked at the body again. Vane had been in Lochdubh for less than 24 hours. He had insulted the locals, bragged about his wealth, and proclaimed his spiritual superiority. In the Highlands, such behaviour was often considered a social faux pas, but it was rarely a capital offence. However, as Hamish scanned the crowd, he saw more than just curiosity. He saw a flicker of something else in the eyes of a few relief, perhaps, or a very well-hidden smugness. His peaceful day was officially ruined. Worse than that, a death this public and this bizarre would draw the attention of the big men from Strathbane like flies to a midden. "Lugs," Hamish said, looking at the purple face of the prophet, "we're going to have company. And I have a terrible feeling it's going to be Detective Chief Inspector Blair." The dog let out a low, mournful howl, as if he knew exactly what that entailed. Shouting, insults, and a complete lack of biscuits. Hamish pulled out his notebook, flipped to a fresh page and wrote, "Victim, Julian Vane." Cause of death appears to be the purity he was looking for. Chapter 3. The heavy brigade descends. The piece of Lochdubh did not simply break, it was pulverized. Usually the only sirens heard in the village were the occasional testing of the fire brigade's alarm or the distant wail of an ambulance taking old Mr. McTavish to Strathbane after head overindulged in the local malt. But this was different. This was the sound of the Strathbane Criminal Investigation Department, and it arrived with all the subtlety of a Viking raid. 2 white Vauxhalls tore into the village square, scattering a flock of indignant seagulls and coming to a halt with a synchronized screech of tires that left black streaks on the ancient cobbles. Out of the lead car stepped Detective Chief Inspector Blair. He was a man whose physical appearance suggested a lifetime of repressed rage and fried breakfasts. His suit was a shade of grey that managed to look cheap despite its price tag, and his face was the colour of a sunset over a polluted industrial estate. "Macbeth!" Blair roared before his feet had even fully cleared the door. "What the hell is this circus? I get a call about a high-profile stiff in a fountain, and I find half the village standing around like Thea waiting for a bus." Hamish, who was still leaning against the fountain with a look of vacant boredom, touched the brim of his cap. "Good morning to you, Inspector. It's a sad business. Mr. Vane here seems to have had a bit of a turn." Blair stomped over, his polished shoes clicking aggressively. Behind him trailed Detective Sergeant McNabb and Detective Corporal Anderson, both looking as if they'd rather be anywhere else, preferably somewhere with a pub and no rain. Blair stopped in front of the fountain and stared at Julian Vane. His eyes bulged. "What is he wearing? Is that a leotard?" "It's a yoga suit, I believe," Hamish said helpfully, "for the spiritual alignment." "He looks like a giant half-peeled grape," Blair sneered. He leaned in closer, then recoiled. "Ugh, and he smells like bird muck. Right, clear these peasants out of here, Macbeth. This is a crime scene, not a bloody garden party." Hamish began the slow, arduous process of gently nudging the villagers back. "Come along now, Mrs. Garrow, Archie. Let the big men from the city do their work. They've got degrees in this sort of thing, you know." Archie McLean lingered a moment too long, his weathered face twisted in a scowl. "He was a right nasty piece of work, that one. Told me my boat was an eyesore." Blair's head whipped around. "Did he now? And I suppose you didn't like that, did you, Grandad? Annés ordre, motive for murder, I say." Archie blinked. "Murder? I didn't say nothing about murder. I just said he was an arse." "Watch your mouth," Blair barked. "McNabb, take this man's details. He's got grudge written all over his ginger-bearded face. Look at those handsplanty of strength there to hold a man down in a fountain." Hamish sighed softly. "Inspector, the fountain has no water in it. He wasn't drowned. And there's a small bottle right there by his foot. I suspect poison." Blair looked down, finally noticing the green glass vial. He didn't use gloves. He pulled a grubby handkerchief from his pocket and scooped it up with a triumphant flourish. "Poison! Brilliant, Macbeth. You finally noticed something after standing here for an hour. Probably some local moonshine or sheep dip. The smell is more like bitter almonds, sir," Hamish ventured. "Cyanide, perhaps." "Don't you try to CSI me, you lanky streak of Highland misery," Blair snapped. "I know what cyanide smells like, and I know who uses it. Poachers, farmers, people who want to get rid of vermin. People exactly like—" He pointed a stubby finger back at Archie McLean, "this disgruntled fisherman here." "Archie's a lobster fisherman, sir," Hamish said mildly. "He wouldn't have much use for cyanide unless the lobsters started an uprising." The crowd chuckled, which was the worst thing they could have done. Blair's face turned a shade of violet that almost matched the corpse. "That's enough. Macbeth, you're relieved. You've contaminated the scene enough with your presence and that carpet with legs you call a dog. Go and direct traffic at the edge of the village. Keep the rubberneckers away." "There isn't any traffic, sir. Just the mail van and the occasional sheep." "Then direct the sheep," Blair screamed. Hamish whistled for lugs. "Very well, sir. It'll be at the station if you need any local knowledge. About the victim's house, for instance. He had a visitor last night." Blair paused, his hand halfway to his radio. "A visitor." Hamish put on his most gormless expression, scratching his head. "Oh, sure, a sharp mind like yours will find the records in no time. It was a flashy car. Red. Or maybe it was maroon. My eyes aren't what they used to be in this mist." "Get out of here." Blair waved him away like a nuisance fly. As Hamish walked away, Lugs trotting faithfully at his heels, he heard Blair shouting orders about arresting Archie for questioning. Hamish knew Archie was as innocent as a newborn lamb mostly, because Archie was too lazy to plan a murder and too tight-fisted to buy expensive poison. But Hamish had seen something Blair hadn't. In the victim's stiff, clawed hand, partially hidden by the spandex sleeve, was a small, torn scrap of blue silk. It wasn't Highland wool, and it certainly wasn't white spandex. "Well, Lugs," Hamish whispered as they reached the edge of the square, "Blair can have the fountain and the fisherman. We'll go and see who owns a red car and a blue silk dress. But first, I think we'll go and mooch a bit of tea from the hotel. I believe Priscilla is back from London." Chapter 4, Tea and Treachery. The Tommel Castle Hotel sat on a rise overlooking the loch, a grey stone monolith that whispered of old money and draughty corridors. It was the sort of place where the soup was always lukewarm, the sherry was always dry, and the guests were usually English people of a certain age who enjoyed being miserable in expensive waterproofs. Hamish Macbeth, with Lugs trotting at his heels like a sentient bundle of lint, pushed through the heavy oak doors. The air inside smelled of beeswax polish, damp tweed, and the faint aristocratic scent of Earl Grey. "Stay there, Lugs," Hamish whispered, pointing to a rug near the entrance. "And try not to look like you're planning to eat the guests." Lugs sighed and collapsed onto the rug, resting his chin on his paws with a look of profound boredom. Hamish headed for the drawing room, his heavy police boots squeaking rhythmically on the polished floorboards. He found Priscilla Halberton Smythe seated by the window, a silver tea service laid out before her. She was as elegant as ever, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, her expression one of cool, detached amusement. "Hey, you," she said, looking up as he approached. "I heard the circus has arrived in town. I saw Chief Inspector Blair's car screaming past the gates like a wounded animal. What has happened now? Has a sheep looked at him the wrong way?" "It's a bit more serious than sheep, Priscilla," Hamish said, sliding into the armchair opposite her with a groan of feigned exhaustion. "Mr. Julian Vane, that new man at the sanctuary, has been found dead in the village fountain. And he wasn't exactly dressed for a funeral." Priscilla's eyebrows rose. "Dead? How very inconvenient for him. He only arrived yesterday. My father was quite looking forward to telling him he was trespassing on the grouse moors. Blair thinks it was poison. He's currently trying to arrest Archie McLean because Archie has a loud voice and a dirty face." Hamish's eyes drifted to the plate of scones on the table. "I don't suppose there's a spare drop of tea for a hard-working officer of the law." Priscilla smiled small, knowing smile that always made Hamish's heart do a nervous little dance. "Help yourself, Hamish, and take a scone. You look like you haven't eaten since the Highland clearances." Hamish didn't need a second invitation. He loaded a scone with an obscene amount of clotted cream and jam. "Vane had a visitor last night," he said between bites. "A flashy red car. Maroon, maybe. Did anyone like that check into the hotel?" Priscilla poured him a cup of tea, her movements precise. "As a matter of fact, yes. A Mrs. Penelope Vane. Julian's ex-wife, or so the register says. She arrived late last night in a very loud red Jaguar. She seemed agitated. She spent most of the morning in the bar, complaining about the lack of decent gin." Hamish paused, a dollop of cream hovering near his lip. "An ex-wife. And I don't suppose she was wearing anything in blue silk?" Priscilla tilted her head. "She was wearing a blue silk scarf when she arrived. Rather a vivid shade of azure." "Why?" "Just a feeling," Hamish murmured. "Blair is busy shouting at the locals, which means he won't bother with the hotel for hours. He thinks the crime was committed by someone who smells of fish. He doesn't believe a Sassenach would kill one of their own in such a public way." "And you think differently?" I think Julian Vane was a man who made his living selling purity and piety to people with more money than sense," Hamish said, his voice dropping its rustic edge. "That kind of business usually leaves a trail of very angry, very impure people behind it. A man doesn't end up in a fountain in a white leotard by accident." "It does sound rather theatrical," Priscilla agreed. "Wait, Hamish, there was someone else. A man arrived this morning just after the news broke. A tall, thin man with a clerical collar, but he didn't look like any minister I've ever seen. He asked for Julian's address and then left in a hurry." Hamish finished his tea and stood up, brushing crumbs from his uniform. A minister and an ex-wife. The plot is thickening faster than Mrs. Kennedy's gravy. "I think he'll go and have a casual chat with Mrs. before Blair realizes there are people in Lochdubh who don't have Highland accents." "Be careful, Hamish," Priscilla said, her voice softening slightly. "Blair is looking for a scapegoat. If you solve this too quickly, hell be furious. But if you don't solve it at all, hell blame you for the incompetence. That's the tragedy of my life, Priscilla, Hamish sighed. I have to be just smart enough to catch the killer, but just stupid enough to let Blair think he did it. It's a very delicate balance. He whistled for Lugs, who scrambled up and followed him out into the mist. As they walked back down toward the village, Hamish's mind was whirring. Blue silk, a red car, and a mysterious minister. Lugs, he said, the wind whipping his ginger hair. I think it's time we did a bit of mooching at the bar. I've a feeling, Mrs. Penelope Vane is the sort of woman who talks a lot when she's had a gin. I am the sort of man people love to talk down to. Chapter 5. The Gin and the Grudge, the bar of the Tummel Castle Hotel, was a cavernous room panelled in dark, brooding oak that seemed to soak up the meagre afternoon light. It was the kind of place where one could easily hide a body, or, at the very least, a very large bar tab. Hamish Macbeth hovered in the doorway, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. He looked less like a police officer and more like a weary traveller who had lost his way and perhaps his ambition. Lugs, sensing the presence of expensive snacks, sat down by the brass footrail and practised his starving orphan expression. At the far end of the bar, bathed in the amber glow of a single lamp, sat a woman who looked like she had been carved out of expensive ice. Penelope Vane was in her late 40s, though her skin was pulled so tight over her cheekbones that she looked perpetually surprised. She wore a tailored navy suit and a string of pearls that probably cost more than Hamish police station. On the stool beside her sat a designer handbag and a very large, very clear martini. Hamish shuffled forward, making sure his boots squeaked as much as possible. "Excuse me, ma'am. I don't suppose you've seen a stray sheep wander through here? A big woolly thing with a suspicious look in its eye?" Penelope turned slowly, her gaze raking over Hamish's rumpled uniform with the disdain one might reserve for a particularly persistent slug. "I am hardly the person to ask about livestock, Constable. I am a guest, not a shepherd. To be sure, Hamish said, leaning against the bar. He caught the eye of the barman, who was polishing a glass with lacklustre enthusiasm. "A ginger beer for me, Angus. And maybe a bit of that cheddar for the beastie here." Hamish turned back to Penelope, flashing her a gormless, wide-eyed grin. "Y'all be Mrs. Bon Ten. I heard we had a celebrity's wife in our midst. Or ex-wife, was it?" The village is buzzing like a disturbed hive. Penelope's grip on her glass tightened. The village is a graveyard with a pub. And Julian was not a celebrity, he was a charlatan who happened to have a knack for convincing lonely women that their bank balances were the only thing standing between them and nirvana. Hamish leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "A charlatan, you say?" And here was I thinking he was a holy man. He looked very dedicated in his white suit this morning. Dedicated to himself, she snapped, taking a long, unrefined gulp of her gin. Julian didn't have a spiritual bone in his body. His sanctuary was nothing more than a tax shelter. He came up here to hide from the inland revenue, and a very persistent man named Arthur Pym. Arthur Pym. Hamish tilted his head. Would that be the gentleman in the clerical collar Priscilla mentioned? A tall, thin man who looks like he's lived on a diet of lemons? Penelope laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. That sounds like Arthur. He was Julian's business manager before Julian found God, and decided he didn't need to share the profits of their last mindfulness retreat in Majorca. Arthur is a man of God, in the same way Julian was a prophet strictly for the branding. Hamish nodded thoughtfully, watching the way the light caught the blue silk scarf draped over her handbag. It was a beautiful thing, vibrant and costly, but as he leaned in to accidentally brush against it while reaching for a piece of cheese, he saw it. The hem of the scarf was frayed, and a small, jagged square of silk was missing. "It's a terrible thing, though," Hamish said, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. "To come all this way just to find him dead in a fountain, and in such a state. He looked quite purple." "Purple was always his colour," Penelope said coldly. She didn't look sad, she looked relieved, like a woman who had finally seen a long-standing debt settled. "I came here to get him to sign the final settlement papers. Had been dodging me for months. Now, I suppose, he'll just have to deal with his estate, which is far more straightforward." "I suppose it is," Hamish mused. "But the police from the city, Thayer, a suspicious lot. DCI Blair, he's got it into his head that a local killed him. He's currently shouting at a man who spends his days talking to lobsters." "Then your DCI is a fool," Penelope said, sliding her empty glass toward the barman. "Julian was killed by his own greed, Constable. Or by someone who finally realized that purity is just another word for empty pockets." Before Hamish could press her further, the heavy doors of the bar swung open with a crash. DCI Blair marched in, followed by a harried-looking Macnab. Blair's face was the colour of a bruised plum, and he was sweating despite the Highland chill. "Macbeth, what did I tell you about wandering off?" Blair bellowed, ignoring the aristocratic hush of the room. "We've found the primary suspect's stash. Archie McLean has a shed full of illegal pesticides. Case closed. Why are you in here bothering this lady?" Hamish stood up, smoothing his tunic. "Just checking on the welfare of our guests, sir. It's a matter of community relations." "Community relations? You're a glorified traffic warden," Blair sneered. He turned to Penelope, his voice shifting into a greasy, sycophantic tone. "Terribly sorry, Mrs. Bain. This village idiot shouldn't have disturbed you. I am Detective Chief Inspector Blair. I've solved the case. We'll have the killer in a cell by nightfall." Penelope looked at Blair with the same expression she had given Hamish, only with added boredom. "How efficient of you, Inspector. I shall sleep much better knowing the lobster man is behind bars." Hamish caught the flicker of a smile on her lips, a smile that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. He whistled for lugs and began to back away. "Well, I'll leave you to the big city experts then," Hamish said, playing the part of the dismissed subordinate to perfection. "I'll just go and check on my my pot of tea. Good day to you, sir. Ma'am." As he stepped out into the hallway, Hamish's mind was no longer on the salmon waiting at home. He had seen the scarf. He had heard about Arthur Pym, and he knew that Archie McLean wouldn't know cyanide from cider. "Lugs," he whispered as they reached the fresh air. "Blair is chasing lobsters, and the ex-wife is drinking to a dead man's estate. I think it's time we found this Minister Pym. I have a feeling his brand of piety is exactly the kind that leads to peril." Chapter 6. The minister's secret. The road to the sanctuary was less a road, and more a suggestion made of gravel and hope, winding precariously along the steep, heather-clad slopes above Lochdubh. The mist had thickened, turning the world into a smudge of grey and charcoal. Hamish Macbeth pedalled his ancient bicycle with a deceptive lack of effort, lugs running alongside with the tireless, rhythmic gait of a wolf that had spent too much time eating biscuits. Hamish was thinking about Archie McLean. By now, Blair would have the poor man in a windowless room in Strathbane, shouting about lobster pots and poison until Archie confessed to the Lindbergh kidnapping just to get a cup of tea. It was a familiar pattern, and one that filled Hamish with a slow, simmering resentment. The trouble with the big city police, lugs, Hamish panted as he crested the final rise, is that they look for a villain who fits the crime. They don't look for the crime that fits the villain. The sanctuary appeared out of the fog like a structural hallucination. It was a low-slung building of glass and polished cedar, looking entirely too sophisticated for a hillside that usually hosted only disgruntled sheep and the occasional stray hiker. A small, nondescript grey car was parked in the turning circle. Near the front door stood a man who looked like he had been constructed entirely from right angles. He was dressed in black, his clerical collar a stark white slash against the gloom. He was currently peering through one of the large floor-to-ceiling windows, his hands cupped against the glass. "Can I help you there, Father?" "Or is it Reverend?" Hamish called out, swinging off his bicycle. The man jumped, spinning around with a speed that suggested a very guilty conscience. His face was narrow and sallow, with eyes that darted about like trapped flies. "Good heavens, you gave me a fright, Constable." "It's the rubber tyres," Hamish said, leaning his bike against a designer stone planter. "They are very quiet, useful for catching poachers and, well, people looking through windows. I take it you're Mr. Arthur Pym." The man straightened his collar, attempting to regain a sliver of dignity. "I am the Reverend Arthur Pym. I was a close spiritual associate of the late Mr. Vane. I heard the tragic news in the village and came to see if I could secure his effects. For the Foundation, you understand. The Foundation for the Purity of Silence," Hamish asked, his voice thick with Highland innocence. "It's a terrible thing, silence, especially the permanent kind. But the house is a crime scene, Mr. Pym. I can't let you in. DCI Blair from Strathbane would have my head on a platter, and he's a man who enjoys his meat." Pym's eyes narrowed. "I have legal standing, Constable. I am the executor of Julian's spiritual estate. There are sensitive documents inside. Ledgers. Records of our donors. People who sought anonymity in their quest for enlightenment." "Ledgers," Hamish repeated, nodding sagely. "Very spiritual things, ledgers. All those columns of figures. It's almost like a prayer, isn't it? Adding up the blessings." Pym let out a sharp, irritated breath. "You are being deliberately obtuse. Julian Vane was a man of great vision, but he was also—" disorganized. I need to ensure that his legacy isn't tarnished by the fact that he was found in a white leotard in a dry fountain. Hamish finished for him. Pym winced. Precisely. It was a lapse in judgment. Julian was prone to ecstatic episodes. He believed the fountain was a nexus of ancient energy. Hamish took a step closer, lugs growling low in his throat. Was it a lapse in judgment that brought his ex-wife Penelope to Lochdubh last night? Or the fact that she's missing a piece of a blue silk scarf? Pym's sallow face went even paler, turning a shade of grey that matched the Highland sky. I wouldn't know about Mrs. Vane's wardrobe. Our relationship was strictly professional. And yet, Hamish mused, Priscilla at the hotel says you were very keen to find Julian's address the moment you arrived. You didn't go to the police. You didn't go to the hospital. You came straight here to look for a ledger. Now, a suspicious man like my boss, DCI Blair, might think you were looking for something more than just names of donors. He might think you were looking for the money Julian found God to avoid sharing. Pym backed toward his car, his hand fumbling for the door handle. This is outrageous. I am a man of the cloth. It's a very nice cloth, Hamish agreed, eyeing the expensive wool of Pym's jacket, but it doesn't have any pockets. Strange, that. Most people who come to Lochdubh have very deep pockets, and they usually leave with them empty. I have nothing more to say to you, Constable Macbeth. If you wish to question me, do it through my solicitors. Pym scrambled into his car, the engine catching with a desperate whine. He reversed blindly, nearly clipping Hamish's bicycle, and sped off down the track, his tyres spitting gravel. Hamish watched the taillights vanish into the mist. He walked over to the window where Pym had been standing. On the other side of the glass, in the sleek, minimalist kitchen, he could see a bottle of expensive-looking sparkling water sitting on the counter. Beside it was a glass half full, and a small, discarded piece of blue silk exactly like the one he'd seen in the fountain. Well, lugs, Hamish sighed. It seems our prophet of purity had a very busy final evening. A visit from a disgruntled partner, a fight with an ex-wife, and a glass of water that probably tasted like bitter almonds. He looked back toward the village. Blair was likely celebrating his capture of Archie McLean with a pint and a boast. Well, let Blair have his lobster man for now, Hamish whispered, because I think Mr. Pym just told me exactly where the red herring is buried. He wasn't looking for a ledger, lugs. He was looking for a way to prove that Penelope Vane got to the fountain first. Chapter 7. The blue lotus the rain had turned from a pervasive mist into a persistent, thin drizzle that felt like being licked by a very large, very cold dog. Hamish Macbeth sat in the back of the village shop, ostensibly checking the expiration dates on tins of evaporated milk, but actually waiting for Mrs. Kennedy to finish her latest bulletin of gossip. "It's a disgrace, Hamish," she said, leaning over the counter, her eyes bright with the thrill of tragedy. "That poor Archie McLean being hauled off to Strathbane. A man who wouldn't hurt a fly, unless that fly was trying to steal a lobster. Blair found the pesticide in his shed, Mrs. Kennedy," Hamish said mildly, picking up a tin of peaches and turning it over in his hands. "He says it's the same stuff that killed the Sassenach." "Pa!" Mrs. Kennedy waved a hand dismissively. "Archie's had that shed for 40 years. It's full of things that haven't been opened since the Queen's coronation. And besides, have you seen his dog, Barnaby?" Hamish looked up. "The little terrier? What about him? He's been moping around the square all morning looking for Archie. He was licking Archie's hands right up until the moment the police put him in the car. If Archie had been messing with death powder, that dog would be toes up in the heather by now. Barnaby's got a nose like a heat-seeking missile." Hamish went still. It was a simple Highland observation, the kind that DCI Blair would dismiss as peasant logic, but it was undeniably true. Cyanide was fast, and it was lethal. If Archie had been handling it, the residue would have finished off a small terrier in minutes. "You're a wise woman, Mrs. Kennedy," Hamish murmured. "Tell me, what do you know about these?" He pointed to a small display on the counter. It featured several green glass bottles, identical to the one found in the fountain, each wrapped in a delicate scrap of blue silk and labelled the Blue Lotus. Essence of purity. "Oh, those, Mrs. Kennedy sighed. Mr. Vane's miracle water. He hired the Ladies' Guild to package them. Said the blue silk represented the throat chakra or some such nonsense. He sold them for £20 a pop to the tourists. It's just tap water with a bit of lavender oil, if you ask me. And who did the wrapping? Mostly Mrs. Wellington at the manse, and young Mary from the hotel. They spent all last Thursday sitting in the church hall, cutting up old silk remnants Mr. Vane provided. Hamish felt a prickle of interest at the back of his neck. Remnants? Like scarves? Yes, though some of it looked like high-end dress material. Penelope Vane apparently donated a trunk of her old things when they first moved in. She told the girls she couldn't bear the sight of them anymore. Hamish thanked her, bought a packet of stale digestive biscuits for lugs, and stepped out into the rain. He walked toward the manse, his mind ticking over the details. The scrap of silk in the fountain hadn't been a clue left by a murderer, it was part of the product's packaging. But someone had replaced the lavender water with something far more permanent. Oh. As he passed the village green, he saw the minister's wife, Mrs. Wellington, standing by her garden gate. She was a formidable woman who treated the Holy Spirit as a personal subordinate and the rest of the village as unruly Sunday school pupils. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Wellington," Hamish called out. "A bit wet for the roses, isn't it?" Mrs. Wellington didn't answer immediately. She was staring fixedly at a patch of dirt near her feet. She looked haggard, her usual iron-grey hair escaping its pins. "The cat is dead, Macbeth," she said, her voice unusually flat. Hamish stopped. "The ginger one? I am sorry to hear that." He found a bottle, she whispered, pointing to the flower bed. "One of those blue lotus things. It must have fallen out of my bag when I came back from the hall." He licked the cork, Macbeth. He was dead before I could even call for him. Hamish vaulted the low stone wall. He found the cat lying near a rosebush. Beside it was a green glass bottle, its blue silk wrapping stained by the damp earth. He didn't need to sniff the air to know what he'd find. "Archie didn't do this," Hamish said softly, more to himself than to her. Archie was being scammed. Vane was selling the locals pure fertilizer that was actually just toxic industrial runoff head bottled to save on disposal fees. He was a fraud in a white suit, and he was killing the very land he claimed to love. But who killed him? Mrs. Wellington asked, her voice trembling. Hamish looked at the bottle. Someone who knew that if you offer a man purity, he'll drink it without question. Someone who knew about the chemicals. And someone who knew exactly where those blue silk remnants came from. He realized then that Blair's perfect case against Archie was a house of cards. The pesticide in Archie's shed was a fakier placebo Vane had sold the fisherman. The real poison was in the blue lotus bottles, and those bottles were being distributed by the most respected women in the village. "I need to go to the hotel," Hamish said, his expression hardening. "I think I've been looking at the ex-wife and the business partner, but I've ignored the most important rule of Lochdubh." "And what's that?" "Never underestimate a person who has been made to feel invisible," Hamish replied. He whistled for lugs, his lazy gait replaced by a purposeful stride. He had to get to the hotel before Blair closed the case and allowed the real killed person who had been quietly watching the prophet exploit the Villageto slip away in a cloud of blue silk and bitter almonds. Chapter 8. The hidden motive. The Tommel Castle Hotel was beginning to feel like a fortress of secrets, its heavy stone walls damp with the weight of things left unsaid. Hamish Macbeth parked his bicycle by the kitchen entrance, ignoring the no unauthorized access sign with the practiced ease of a man who considered all of Lochdubh his personal living room. He found Mary, the young maid Mrs. Kennedy had mentioned in the silver polishing room. It was a small windowless cubbyhole that smelled of acrid chemicals and old metal. Mary was a quiet girl with a pale, heart-shaped face and eyes that always seemed to be looking for an exit. When Hamish entered, she jumped, nearly dropping a heavy Georgian teapot. "Easy now, Mary," Hamish said, his voice as soft as the Highland mist. "I'm not here to arrest the teapot. I just wanted to ask you about those blue lotus bottles." Mary's hands shook as she rubbed a cloth over the silver. "I already told the inspector. We just wrapped them, Mr. Vane brought the bottles and we tied the silk. That was all." "I am sure it was," Hamish said, leaning against a stack of crates. He pulled a digestive biscuit from his pocket and offered her half. She shook her head. He ate it himself, the crunching sound unnervingly loud in the small room. "But the silk, Mary, Mrs. Kennedy said it came from Mrs. Vane's old things. That's a lot of expensive material for a man like Julian to just give away, isn't it?" "He didn't give it away," Mary whispered, her voice barely audible. "He took it. He told us it was a sacrifice for the greater good. He was always talking about sacrifices." Hamish hazel eyes sharpened. "Did he ask for a sacrifice from you, Mary? Or perhaps from your sister, Jean?" The girl's face went from pale to a ghostly translucent white. She stopped polishing. "Jean's a good girl. She's only 17. She went to him because she was depressed after our mother passed. She thought he could heal her. And did he? He purified her," Mary said, and the bitterness in her voice was like a physical blow. He told her that to be clean, she had to give up her shame. He recorded their sessions. Constable. He told her if she ever stopped coming to the sanctuary, or if she didn't bring him the donations he required from our father's savings, he'd show the recordings to the whole village. He called it transparency of the soul. Hamish felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. The dark undercurrent of Lochdubh was rarely about grand conspiracies, it was almost always about the small, ugly ways people hurt each other. Julian Vane wasn't just a fraud or a polluter, he was a blackmailer who used piety as a weapon. He was going to ruin her, wasn't he? Hamish asked. He laughed at her, Mary said, her eyes finally meeting his. They were filled with a cold, desperate fire. He said a little Highland girl's reputation wasn't worth the silk he wrapped his bottles in. He drank that water every morning in the square to show how pure he was. Everyone saw him, and everyone saw the bottles Hamish finished. He understood now. It wasn't a robbery. It wasn't about the inland revenue or an ex-wife's settlement. It was about a sister's life and a family's honour, things that mattered more in the Highlands than all the gold in London. But there was one detail that didn't fit. Mary was a good girl, a hard worker, but she didn't have access to cyanide. She didn't have the death powder Blair was so obsessed with. Where did the poison come from, Mary? I don't know what you mean, she said, her voice turning flat and robotic again. She resumed polishing the teapot with frantic energy. I just wrap the bottles, Constable. That's all I do. Hamish watched her for a moment, then sighed. You're a good sister, Mary, but you're a terrible liar. You didn't do it, did you? You knew about it, and you're glad he's dead, but you didn't put the poison in that bottle. He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. One more thing. That minister, Arthur Pym. He seemed very interested in Vane's ledgers. Do you think those ledgers might have names in them? Names of other girls like Jean? Pym is worse than Vane, Mary spat. Vane was the face, but Pym was the one who kept the files. He called them his insurance policies. He's staying in room 4. He's been there all afternoon, burning papers in the grate. Hamish nodded. The motive was clear now. Vane had become a liar-believer, narcissistic peacock who was drawing too much attention with his public purifications and his eccentric behaviour. Pym wanted the blackmail business to stay quiet and profitable, but Mary had been the one to provide the opportunity. She had known which bottle Vane would take to the fountain. She had likely pointed it out to someone. Lugs, Hamish whispered as they stepped back into the corridor. We have a killer who wants to protect their sister, and a businessman who wants to protect his secrets. And then we have DCI Blair, who just wants to protect his promotion. He looked up toward the stairs leading to room 4. He could smell the faint, acrid scent of burning paper wafting through the floorboards. The trap is almost ready. Lugs, Hamish murmured. We just need to make Mr. Pym think that the stupid local copper has found something he shouldn't have. Something much more valuable than a ledger. 9. The trap is set. The hallway of the Tummel Castle Hotel was a tunnel of shadows and the muffled sounds of distant silverware. Hamish Macbeth stood outside room 4, his nose twitching. The scent of burning paper was unmistakable, dry, charred smell that spoke of panicked erasures. He didn't knock. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe and began to whistle a low, mournful Highland dirge. It was a tuneless, irritating sound designed to grate on the nerves of anyone with a guilty conscience. After a minute, the door jerked open. Arthur Pym stood there, his face smudged with soot and his clerical collar undone at the throat. He looked less like a man of God and more like a man of the gutter. What is it now, Macbeth? Pym hissed, his eyes darting to the corridor behind Hamish. I told you I have nothing to say to the local constabulary. Hamish stopped whistling and gave him a wide, vacant grin. Oh, I'm not here for a statement, Mr. Pym. I just thought you'd like to know that the divers are arriving from Strathbane tomorrow morning. Pym froze. Divers? Whatever for? Well, Hamish said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial rumble. DCI Blair is convinced the lobster man threw the real evidence into the loch. He's looking for a heavy metal box. Said it was full of insurance policies. Apparently, Julian Vane told his ex-wife had hidden his most valuable files in a waterproof chest under the old pier. It was a blatant lie, crafted with the effortless precision of a man who spent his life studying human greed. Hamish watched the beads of sweat break out on Pym's upper lip. The old pier? Pym repeated, his voice cracking. That's absurd. Julian was a dreamer. He didn't have any files. That's what I told the inspector. Hamish agreed heartily. I said, "Sir, a holy man like Mr. Vane wouldn't have secret records of all the people he's been squeezing for money." But Blair wouldn't listen. "He's even got a search warrant for the hotel rooms, but he's so busy filling out the paperwork in the bar that he won't be up here for another hour." Hamish tapped his nose. "I thought I'd give you the heads up. Professional courtesy, you understand. Between men of the cloth and men of the law." Pym's eyes flared with a desperate, calculating light. "An hour, you say?" At least, Hamish said, stretching his lanky arms. "I'm off to the kitchen to see if I can mooch a bit of shepherd's pie. Lugs here is famished. Good night to you, Reverend." Hamish turned and sauntered down the hall, his boots thudding heavily on the carpet. He didn't look back. He knew the nature of a man like Pym. A blackmailer can tolerate many things, but the thought of his leverage sitting at the bottom of a loch, waiting to be hauled up by a police diver, was a special kind of torture. 10 minutes later, Hamish was crouched behind a stack of weathered lobster creels near the old stone pier. The rain had ceased, leaving the air cold and sharp, smelling of salt and rotting seaweed. Beside him, Lugs was a silent, shivering shadow. "Steady, Lugs," Hamish whispered. "Hell be here. A man like that can't help himself. He needs to be the one holding the strings." The sound of footsteps soon crunched on the gravel. It wasn't the confident stride of a local, but the quick, stumbling gait of a city man out of his element. Arthur Pym appeared at the end of the pier, clutching a heavy rusted iron key and a long-handled gaff he must have scavenged from the hotel's potting shed. Oh, he looked frantically around, his breath coming in white plumes. He knelt at the edge of the pier, peering into the black, swirling waters of the loch. "Where is it?" Pym muttered, his voice trembling with rage. "Where did that golden-haired fool hide it?" He began to poke the gaff into the water, sweeping it back and forth near the pilings. He was so focused on the depths that he didn't hear the soft click of a torch being switched on. The beam of light hit Pym squarely in the face. He shrieked, lost his balance, and nearly tumbled into the freezing water. "Looking for something, Mr. Pym?" Hamish asked, stepping out from behind the creels. He wasn't smiling anymore. His face was set in the hard, grim lines of a man who had seen too much of the world's ugliness. I was just checking the safety of the pier," Pym stammered, dropping the gaff. "At 11 o'clock at night? In the dark? With a boat hook?" Hamish shook his head. "You weren't looking for a box, Arthur. There is no box. I made it up. I wanted to see if Yow'd come running to protect the files you used to ruin girls like Jean." Pym's face contorted into a mask of pure malice. "You stupid ginger-haired peasant. You have nothing. Julian killed himself with his own stupidity. He drank that water every day. Someone just helped nature along. Someone like you." "I didn't touch his bottles," Pym shouted, his voice echoing off the hills. "It was the girl, Mary. She hated him. She saw me with the cyanide I use for the specimens in my collection. She's the one who took it. I just didn't stop her." Hamish's heart sank. He had hoped for a different answer. But as Pym spoke, a shadow moved behind the stone pillar of the pier's warehouse. "Is that right, Arthur?" a cold feminine voice asked. Penelope Vane stepped into the light. She was holding a small, silver-plated pistol, and her eyes were as hard as the granite beneath their feet. "I think," she said, her voice steady and lethal, "it's time we discussed who really owns those files, and who really gave Mary the idea." Hamish stepped between them, his hand going slowly to his truncheon. "Now, ladies and gentlemen," he said, his Highland lilt returning, "let's not do anything that's going to make a lot of paperwork for me. I've had a very long day, and am quite certain DCI Blair is just around the corner." It was the final lie of the night. Blair was currently 3 sheets to the wind in the hotel bar, but the mere mention of his name was enough to make Pym bolt. Chapter 10. The confrontation the old stone pier felt like the edge of the world. To the left, the black waters of the loch lapped hungrily against the barnacled pilings to the right. The jagged silhouette of the mountains stood like silent judges. Arthur Pym stared at the silver pistol in Penelope Vane's hand, his face transitioning from soot-streaked terror to a low animal snarl. "You think you can just shoot your way out of this, Penelope? You're the one who provided the remnants. You're the one who told Mary that Julian was a cancer that needed to be cut out." Penelope didn't flinch. The wind caught her blonde hair, whipping it across her face, but her aim remained steady. "Julian was a nuisance, Arthur. But you were the brain. You were the one who kept the ledger of sins that paid for my alimony. If Julian died, the business was mine. But I couldn't have you dangling those files over my head for the next 20 years. Hamish Macbeth stepped forward, his long shadow stretching across the wet stones. Ah! He looked remarkably calm for a man standing between a blackmailer and a woman with a firearm. Now, Mrs. Hamish said, his voice a low, soothing, melodic burr. That's a very pretty toy, but it makes a terrible noise. It'll wake the whole village, and then he'll have to explain why a London lady is shooting a minister on a Tuesday night. The paperwork alone would take me until Christmas. Get out of the way, Macbeth, Penelope snapped. He's a parasite. He was going to sell those files to the highest bidder the moment Julian was in the ground. I was going to protect the foundation, Pym shrieked, backing away toward the very edge of the pier. One heel was already dangling over the drop. You're the murderer. You gave the girl the cyanide. You took it from the estate's old greenhouse supplies. Hamish shook his head slowly. No, Mr. Pym. I think you both did it. A little partnership of convenience. You provided the poison and the opportunity, and Mrs. Vane here provided the packaging and the persuasion. You used a frightened young girl to do your dirty work, thinking the stupid locals would blame a fisherman with a messy shed. Luggs let out a low, menacing growl, his hackles rising. The dog sensed the breaking point before the humans did. Pym suddenly lunged not at Penelope, but at Hamish, hoping to bowl the lanky policeman over and vanish into the darkness of the heather. He was surprisingly fast for a man who looked like a stick insect, his fingers clawing at Hamish's throat. But Hamish Macbeth was not the lazy peasant he chose to portray. With a fluid, athletic grace that would have stunned DCI Blair, he pivoted. He caught Pym's wrist in a grip of the strength of a man who spent his days hauling sheep and rowing boat sand twisted. Pym let out a yelp of pain, his legs tangling. As he fell, he collided with Penelope, who had stepped forward to fire. The silver pistol clattered to the stones, skittering toward the edge of the loch. My gun, Penelope cried, reaching for it. Leave it, Mom, Hamish commanded. Yet Pym pinned to the cold stone with one knee, the minister sobbing and gasping for air. Luggs, watch her. The dog didn't need to be told twice. Luggs stood over the fallen pistol, bearing a set of surprisingly sharp teeth at Penelope Vane. She froze, looking at the dog, then at the towering ginger-haired policeman who suddenly looked very much like the law. It's over, Hamish said, his voice flat. I've got the bottle Mary didn't quite manage to hide. The one with your fingerprints on the silk, Mrs. And I've got the charred remains of the ledger from the hotel grate, Mr. Pym. You didn't burn it nearly as well as you thought. It was another Lyeth ledger was a pile of ash, but the psychological blow landed. Pym's resistance collapsed. She made me do it. She said Julian was going to cut us both out. She said the girl was the perfect scapegoat. Shut up, you coward. Penelope spat, slumped against a lobster creel. Hamish sighed, the adrenaline beginning to fade, replaced by a weary sadness. You both forgot one thing about Lochdubh. We might be slow, and we might like our tea, but we look after our own. You tried to ruin a young girl's life to cover your greed. That's something the Highlands never forgets. In the distance, the faint, distorted sound of a police siren began to wail. It wasn't the heroic arrival of the cavalry, it was Blair, finally roused from his gin-soaked stupor by a frantic call from the hotel manager, who had found the minister's room in shambles. Hamish looked down at his prisoners. Right then, let's get you both stood up. I need to make sure you look properly guilty before the big man arrives to take the credit. You're letting him take the credit, Penelope asked, stunned. After you caught us? Hamish gave her a small, dry smile. If I take the credit, they'll want to promote me. They'll want to send me to a glass office in Glasgow where I can't smell the heather or poach a salmon. And I'd rather face a dozen of you than a single day in the city. He pulled 2 sets of rusty handcuffs from his belt. Now, look miserable. It'll make the inspector feel much better about himself. Chapter 11. The credits shift the blue lights of the police cruisers strobed against the damp stone walls of the pier, turning the mist into a rhythmic, haunting neon. DCI Blair descended from his vehicle like an angry, slightly uncoordinated god. His tie was askew, his face was a mottled shade of crimson, and he was tucking his shirt into his trousers with a series of frantic jerks. Macbeth, Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the silent surface of the loch. What the bloody hell is going on? I get a report of shots fired and find you standing here with 2 of our most prominent guests in irons. Have you finally lost the few marbles you had left? Hamish Macbeth stood perfectly still, his hands tucked into his belt, looking for all the world like a man who had accidentally stumbled upon a minor traffic violation. Beside him, Penelope Vane sat on a lobster creel, her designer suit ruined by fish scales, looking utterly defeated. Arthur Pym was huddled on the ground, weaking softly into his soot-stained clerical collar. "Ah, Inspector," Hamish said, his voice reaching a pitch of respectful, wide-eyed admiration. "Why, you've arrived just in time. It was exactly as you predicted in the bar. Your instinct was spot on, sir." Blair stopped mid-stride, his chest puffing out instinctively. "My instinct? Which one?" "The one about the outsiders, sir," Hamish lied smoothly, stepping closer and dropping his voice so the gathered constables couldn't hear the fabrication. "You said to me, Macbeth, don't be fooled by the fisherman. Look for the sophisticated criminal mind. Look for the one who has the most to gain from the estate. I took your advice, sir. I followed your lead to the pier, and there they were trying to dispose of the final evidence of their Blue Lotus conspiracy." Blair blinked. He looked at Penelope, then at the snivelling Pym, and then back to Hamish. A slow, oily grin began to spread across his face. I did say that, didn't I? I told you not to get distracted by the local riffraff." "You did, sir. A classic pincer movement, you called it. You sent me here as a scout while you, coordinated the tactical response from the hotel's central communications hub." "The bar, you mean?" Macnab muttered from behind Blair. Blair spun around and glared at his sergeant. "The operations centre, Macnab. And keep your mouth shut if you want to see your pension before you're 80. He turned back to Hamish, his eyes gleaming with the prospect of a front-page headline in the Strathbane Gazette. "So, they confessed, did they?" "Oh, quite thoroughly, sir. Mr. Pym here was just explaining how they used the Blue Lotus bottles as a delivery system for the cyanide thade siphoned from the Vane estate. They were going to pin it on poor Archie MacLean, but your brilliant strategy of letting them think they were safe forced their hand." Hamish reached into his pocket and produced the silver-plated pistol, holding it by the barrel with a handkerchief. "And here is the weapon, Mrs. Vane used to threaten the clerical associate when the partnership soured. A very tidy case, Inspector. The superintendent will be delighted. I expect there'll be a commendation in it for you. Perhaps even that promotion to commander you've been mentioning." The mention of commander acted like a tonic on Blair. He practically vibrated with self-importance. He marched over to Penelope Vane and wagged a stubby finger in her face. "Thought you could outsmart the Strathbane CID, did you? Thought we were just a bunch of country bumpkins? Well, you didn't count on my deductive powers, Mrs. Van." Penelope looked at Blair, then at Hamish, who gave her a subtle warning wink and then let out a sigh of pure contempt. "Just take me to a cell that doesn't smell of sheep, you buffoon." Buffoon. Hear that, Macnab? The arrogance of the criminal classes. Blair turned to his men. "Right. Process them. Get the forensics team down here to sweep the pier. And someone find that fisherman and let him goatle him. It was a deep cover operation to flush out the real killers. It was my idea to use him as bait." As the flurry of activity began, with officers scurrying about and Blair shouting orders into his radio, Hamish slowly backed away into the shadows. He whistled softly for Lugs, who trotted over, looking quite pleased with himself. "You're not staying for the victory parade, Macbeth?" Macnab asked, pausing as he led a handcuffed Pym toward the car. He looked at Hamish with a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. He knew exactly who had solved the case. "No, Sergeant," Hamish said, his lanky frame beginning to blend into the mist. "The inspector has everything well in hand. I've a pot of salmon on the stove that's been waiting far too long. And besides, I am just a useful peasant, remember?" Macnab shook his head. "You're a menace, Hamish. One of these days Blair's going to realise you're making a fool of him. Not as long as I keep handing him the medals." "Macnab," Hamish whispered. "Not as long as I get to stay in Lochdubh." He turned and began the long walk back toward the village, the sound of Blair's boastful shouting fading behind him, replaced by the ancient comforting silence of the hills. Chapter 12. The quiet returned the morning after the storm was unnervingly bright. The soft weather had finally broken, replaced by a sky so blue and sharp it looked as though it had been polished with a silk cloth. The peaks of the mountains were reflected perfectly in the still, dark glass of the loch, and the only sound in the village square was the rhythmic clink-clink of Archie MacLean's hammer as he mended a lobster creel by the harbour. Hamish Macbeth sat on the bench outside the police station, a chipped mug of coffee cradled in his large, calloused hands. He was dressed in his oldest tweed jacket, the one with the leather patches at the elbows that smelled permanently of peat smoke and lugs. The dog was stretched out at his feet, belly up to the sun, twitching his paws in a dream of chasing very slow, very fat rabbits. "Morning, Hamish," called out Mrs. Kennedy, as she pinned a fresh notice to the post office door. "I see the big men have cleared out. The square feels positively empty without all that shouting and the screeching of tyres." "It does indeed, Mrs. Kennedy," Hamish replied with a lazy wave. "A bit of peace is a fine thing for the digestion." "I saw the papers," she added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hum. "DCI Blair is all over the Strathbane Gazette. Mastermind detective cracks cult killer case. He looks like a toad that swallowed a very large fly in that photograph." Hamish chuckled. "He's a man who enjoys the limelight, Mrs. Kennedy, and he did a grand job of coordinating the tactical response. My own role was strictly observational." "Observational!" Archie McLean barked from across the road. He stood up, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "He had me in a cell for 6 hours asking me if I knew the chemical formula for sheep dip. If it weren't for you finding that fancy woman and the minister on the pier, I'd be eating porridge in Barley by now." "It was the inspector's pincer movement," Archie, Hamish said firmly, though his eyes twinkled. "I just happened to be the one on the ground when the trap snapped shut." Archie shook his head, a slow grin spreading across his weathered face. "Whatever you say, Hamish, but there's a crate of the finest langoustines sitting on your back doorstep. A thank you from the peasantry." Hamish watched Archie return to his work. The village was returning to its natural rhythm, the brief, violent intrusion of Julian Vane already fading into local legend. The sanctuary would likely stand empty for a while, a glass and chrome monument to a man who had tried to sell purity while drowning in his own greed. As for Mary and Jean, Hamish had made sure that the sensitive files Pym had been so desperate to protect had met a very permanent end in the hotel's large Victorian boiler. There were no recordings, no ledgers, and no more shadows hanging over the girls' futures. Blair hadn't even noticed their absence from the final report. He had been too busy practicing his stern but fair expression for the television cameras. A sleek silver BMW pulled up to the curb, and Priscilla Halberton Smythe stepped out. She looked as cool and elegant as the morning air, her blonde hair caught in a simple silk scarf knot blue, Hamish noted with relief, but a pale, shimmering cream. "I'm leaving for London this afternoon, Hamish," she said, leaning against the station wall. "Father is insufferable when he's been proven right about outsiders bringing trouble, and I find I need a change of scenery." Hamish felt the familiar, dull ache in his chest, the one he always felt when Priscilla left, but he kept his expression carefully neutral. "Safe travels, Priscilla. London will be a lot noisier than Lochdubh, I expect. And a lot less interesting," she murmured, her eyes lingering on his for a second longer than was strictly necessary. "Blair told me he's recommending you for a special citation. He said your docile nature made you the perfect decoy." Hamish grinned. "Docili. I like that. It sounds like a well-behaved cow." "You're a terrible man, Hamish Macbeth," Priscilla laughed. "You let that buffoon take all the glory just so you can sit here and poach salmon in peace. It's a fair trade, Priscilla. Glory doesn't keep the rain off your head or the stove warm at night." She reached out and patted his hand, a fleeting gesture that stayed with him long after her car had vanished around the bend of the Loch Road. Hamish stood up and stretched, his joints popping. The day was moving on, and there were things to be done. He had a crate of langoustines to peel, a pot of tea to brew, and a very large, very illegal salmon to finish eating before the water bailiff decided to take a stroll. He looked at the station, the mountains, and the quiet, shimmering water of the loch. DCI Blair was likely at headquarters right now, basking in the glow of a job well done, dreaming of a corner office in Glasgow. And Hamish Macbeth was exactly where he wanted to be. "Come on, lugs," Hamish said, whistling for the dog. "The prophet is gone, the Sassenachs have retreated, and I believe I can hear a pot of stew calling our names." As he walked back inside, closing the door on the bright Highland sun, the only thing left of the mystery was a single blue silk thread caught on the door frame, which the wind caught and carried away into the heather, leaving Lochdubh once again to its secrets and its silence.